what do people think in China about how their country is headed? How hopeful are they, and what's their attitude towards the governance they live with?
Well, I think what comes through is there's not an overwhelming degree of dissatisfaction. I mean, there is a clear distinction between what people think of national government and what they think of local government. The satisfaction rates for national government are in the high 80s, low 90s. If you refine it, which we actually do in terms of being extremely satisfied rather than just, well, it's okay, kind of satisfied, it drops quite dramatically down to, 20% or so, 15, 20%. So there's not extreme enthusiasm, but there's not much dissatisfaction either. Most people feel it's kind of okay. Where you see a more nuanced response, as I said, is at the local level, where really most services in China are provided by the local government. And there you see dissatisfaction levels much lower. And what is interesting in the most recent poll we did is that in big cities, there's higher satisfaction with local government, as there is in villages. Where the problem seems to be is in the smaller towns and cities, which is important because that's a focal point for development, for urbanization, for the new leadership. Yet it seems people feel that the quality of governance there, the commitment of their officials, is not as good as it is either in the villages or in the larger cities. And in part that can be explained, that you can't criticize Xi Jinping in China. The press and the media doesn't have, critical reports in 60 Minutes or other kinds of programs about, what is going wrong with the national government. And, and I think for most people, why bother? I mean, it's a long way away. It doesn't really affect us so much, or we don't see it affects us so much. So I think there's some kind of distortion in that satisfaction level. But as I've said, there's also not a clear indication that there's great dissatisfaction in China either. I think the other thing that comes out, which is quite interesting, is what would they like government to do? And there I think you see that the things that the old system was good at and they're doing now, the kind of hard infrastructure, electricity, water, gas, and so forth, is not so important to many individual citizens. They're much more concerned about the family and household impacts of the reform program. So medical insurance, job opportunities, and so forth. And what is interesting, what has really risen up in the last few years as a concern amongst citizens, both rural and urban, interestingly, are environmental health issues and environmental management and environmental control. And whether that's because it's now licensed, because the press talks about it a lot more, whether it's genuinely a bubbling up from below is hard to discern, but I suspect it's a combination of the two. And then you get very interesting things that, respondents are smart. Family planning, for example, they know they have to say that this is a wonderful service from the government. They're extremely satisfied with it. So it often comes out as one of the services that citizens are most satisfied with. If you ask them, is it important and should government be doing it, it always comes out ranked lowest. So you get the nuance with it, that they know they should say they're satisfied, but they also don't think it's something the government should be involved in.
How much can one trust these surveys then? You suggested that people aren't assuming that their responses will be anonymous, so they're worried about repercussions. On the other hand, I know in your survey, they often express sharp dissatisfaction with officials, above all local officials, who could make their lives miserable if they wanted to. Should we basically say trust Pew that people are basically satisfied with the direction the country is going in?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I don't know about the Pew survey so much, and they're so sort of macro in their approach. I'm not sure it really tells us an awful lot, because I think if you ran them in the Soviet Union, probably people would tell you were pretty satisfied until they weren't satisfied. And I suspect the same will be in China. People will keep telling you they're reasonably satisfied until something goes wrong, and then they'll tell you they're not. But I do think that there's a lot of survey work being done within China, and most of those polls tend to reflect the same messages. What I find encouraging about the poll we've done is that nothing really surprised me with it. There's nothing that seems really counterintuitive to what you think people might reply. Now, the percentages could be off. They might be off by, a positive value because people feel they shouldn't be too critical. But if you do it as a time series over time, I think that at least gives you some way to gauge, are things improving or are things getting worse? And I think one of the interesting features under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao was that on the whole, up until 2011, the indicators were improving. And they were also, you could see policy connections, because in the villages, amongst the lower income strata within the villages, their appreciation or satisfaction with government, also at the local level, went up the most. I mean, when we first did the poll in 2003, they were the most dissatisfied. By 2011, they were, together with the richest people in the village, the most satisfied group within the village. That seems to me an indication that the policies of Hu and Wen to try to improve the lot of those that had not benefited so well from reforms had worked its way through into the villages. So that's why I sort of say I think that I'm encouraged by the fact that nothing really takes me aback as being sort of counterintuitive to what you might think is happening. So in that sense, I think, yes, they're reasonably trustworthy. But I think it's like, Chinese statistics. I mean, take them as indications rather than precise. I mean, I don't think because it says it's 85.7%, you should really believe it's 85.7%. So it's indicative, I think, of trends.
Let's end by taking a step back and looking at the large-scale, long-term trajectory of governance in China. Mm-hmm. You've been describing a one-party regime which, by its nature, depends on fear, fear of people expressing disagreement in fundamental manners very publicly, mm-hmm. Getting together to express that disagreement on fundamental matters collectively. The protests that are mm-hmm. Brought out, I take it, are all about local issues of real estate, wages, sure. And the like. It's a system that depends on historical ignorance or historical stupidity. And it's been striking up until now that Mao has been just an icon. He's on all the money.
Oh, sure.
The only portrait is Tiananmen Square, even though the current regime is based on opposition to his policies.
Well, I think it's important to make the qualification that it doesn't rely on fear alone. I mean, it also relies on the fact that, tremendous and spectacular economic growth has occurred over the last 30, 35 years. So I think to a lot of citizens, I think you have to be careful which categories of citizens you're talking about. And, I think for a large swathe of citizens, life has only got better over the last 30, 35 years. Now, that provides, I think, a lot of residual support to the regime. Now, it's fragile because it's just based on expectations for the future that my life will continue to improve in this way. And then the question becomes, if that doesn't turn out to be the case, does the Communist Party have a deeper legitimacy to draw on to prevent people becoming disillusioned with it? And I think that's where the fragility of the system comes in, because, for many people, the party has become instrumental. You know, it's delivered goods for me. You know, it's allowed an economic environment where I can thrive. It's increased individual personal freedoms for me. If it carries on doing that, then I think there's not only, you know, the fear, which clearly keeps sets of people in line, and it sets clear demarcations. There's a limit to how far you can go in terms of being publicly critical. And as you know as well as I do, in private, you know, people are as critical as, you know, citizens in any country around the world. But taking that into the public arena is where the threat is. So I think it's more than just, I don't believe it's just ruling by fear. I think it's also ruling by having delivered results for very significant sections of the population, not only the elite within the party, but a very broad-based middle class as well. So I think that's important, I think, as a factor. But it does lead to the question of how people will evaluate government performance moving forward, and that if economic growth does slow, and if there's less largesse to be dispensed, will that then lead to a more critical public expression of concern about the Communist Party and its practice? And that's why, you know, going back to some of the things I've talked about earlier, why I think now the current leadership is trying to portray itself more increasingly as a protector of China's cultural heritage as much as it is the initiator of the Communist Revolution.
I think if we want to describe the Chinese political model in a kind of slogan form, it would be democracy at the bottom, experimentation in the middle, and meritocracy on top. Over the past, in the period of reform, let's say over the past 30 years or so, there's been local level democracy in the form of competitive elections, what Westerners are more familiar with. And that part has been investigated very thoroughly by scholars. Also, the Chinese government strongly encourages foreign scholars to study that form of political change. So, and it's been quite transparent, and of course it's imperfect, but generally speaking there's been improvement in terms of the elections that are becoming more free, more competitive, less controlled by the local cadres and so on. The other plank of political reform, so to speak, is experimentation in the middle. And here, I'm from Canada, and we're also familiar with the American model, where when we think of a big country, we think of a federal system where the divisions of power are very clear. In China, as we know, it's also a big country, and there's so much happening below level of central government in experimental form, and this is often how change takes place, not just economic change, but changes in forms of governance, tried out at a local level of government, and if it works, and if there's political support, then often the local level change is expanded to other parts of the country. And in a way, it's more flexible than a rigid federal system, because once you have, first of all, the central government has the power to expand experiments, which it might not have in a federal system, and it also has power to carry out experiments at local levels. And then the third change, which in a way is most important, of course, each of these planks, as we know, the communist government is basically in control. But the third plank, which has been studied, and it's only recently that it's becoming more of a subject of scholarship, is what we can call the meritocratization of the system. And ever since the early 1990s, the way of selecting public officials has become much more meritocratic, meaning that there's a fairly rigorous examination system to choose officials, and then they're promoted based on the performance at lower levels of government. Now, those are all the ideals of the system, and it's been high, and of course there's overlap between different kind of planks, so to speak, and it's been imperfectly implemented, but as a model, I think it's a pretty good model, and rather than assume that China should, move towards this, competitive elections for choosing officials at all levels of government, this kind of one system fits all view that the only way of selecting government officials is by competitive elections. I think we should allow, I think the system, first of all, it resonates much more with Chinese political culture and with its history and so on, and it's also much more useful to address many contemporary problems. The advantages of democracy at local level are clear, right? the people know the character of the leaders they choose. The issues are relatively easier to understand, relatively easy to understand, you know, whether to build a school or a hospital or it's easier to generate a sense of community at a local level. And it's not just, you know, many Western, so-called Western philosophers, you know, from Aristotle to Montesquieu to Rousseau have made this point, right, that democracy works best at the local level. But at higher levels of government, the issues are much more complex, much more difficult to understand. The people don't know the character of the leaders that they would support if they were chosen by elections. And it doesn't follow that, you know, that democratic elections should be the preferred method of choosing people at higher levels of government.
There are reasons to be afraid of speaking out on some topics, including the topic of multi-party democracy in China. Of course, with my non-existent Chinese, the people I talk to about these dangers are professors. And some of them are worried. It varies from person to person. They're not worried about being put in jail. But the thought that they might not get promoted or might not get their 5-year contracts renewed is real for them. If the party secretary were to hear about their teaching about virtues as well as problems in multi-party democracy as a model for China, they would worry. Isn't that a cost? Isn't that an inevitable cost of the one-party system that people are fearful of speaking out?
Well, I guess it depends what we mean by, I mean, again, a recent study which has been published in the American Political Science Review by Gary King and others shows that the censorship system is directed not so much at those who speak out against government in various ways, but rather at those who seek to collectively organize, at collective mobilization. So generally speaking, it's much more free in a classroom than one would expect, at least from the outside, so long as one doesn't call for some form of collective mobilization. And censorship takes place when it comes to publications. Again, if it's small academic publications, usually it's relatively free. You know, the more popular the media form, the more severe the censorship. Of course, it's all in Chinese. They don't care what people write in English. In terms of those who are subject to political controls, I mean, it's really, you know, there are clear areas where, you know, if you were to give a whole talk on, you know, June 4th, 1989 with videos and so on, obviously that would be that would be, you know, that would be a reason to worry. But generally speaking, even the famous, you know, the cases that are widely reported abroad of people being censored for their political views, you know, sometimes it's as much a problem might have to do with what we can call meritocracy. I mean, if they're not, if they're often not producing a good academic output and they're not good teachers, you know, then they might not get promoted, but they could use politics as a reason to criticize the system. So I just mean we need to be careful to that. We need to be sensitive to that possibility. In terms of the multi-party system, I mean, obviously, you know, every system has advantages and disadvantages, and I don't even like the word one party, because it's not a party, right? I mean, it's a huge organization. It's 85 million people, and basically it selects elites from different social groups. So let's call it a kind of union, so for the system to work well, for its advantages, it has to plan for, you know, the advantages relative to electoral democracies, you know, are that the leaders are, you know, go through a decades-long training process. They won't make beginners' mistakes. They could plan for the long term. And there are disadvantages to the system, and one clear disadvantage is that, you know, just we have to play. There are limits on multi-party mobilization. I mean, if people want to mobilize in a call for multi-party rule and organize, then that's going to undermine the whole system. So I think the government or this constitutional system should be more clear in saying that this is just a limit. You can't do this, and make the punishments more explicit. If it is a meritocratic, union at the end of the day, then the boundary has to be clear that we can have lots of criticism, but not open social mobilization for multi-party rule, and just make that explicit, and then I think it would be much better in terms of reducing fear among people, especially social critics. Yeah.
No, the important line that you're emphasizing. How does it get enforced? And that is, one can see it's being enforced with, for example, through an independent judiciary. People can bring suit, or the judge says, no, you can't do it. It's perfectly legal. Can there be a strong independent judiciary in a one-party regime in which, in the real world, in which cadre who aren't going to stand up for elections, they don't want to be told what to do? That's only you. It's not just professors who don't want to be told what to do. Cadre don't want to be told what to do. They have power. In China, right, they really aren't told what to do by an independent judiciary. If it's hard to organize against them, then that pressure is put off. So how is this line drawing enforced?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain forms of organization. I just meant that there's limits against organizing, in a multi-party rule at the top. But beyond that, there's lots of room for organization of different sorts. And in terms of the independent judiciary, I mean, it really depends what the issue is. If it's corruption, then Hong Kong is part of China, and you have an independent anti-corruption agency. Now at the local levels, there's been an important change whereby basically the judicial officials in charge of anti-corruption are no longer all their posts to the local governments. It's from higher levels of government, so they're more independent in that sense, which is very important. But I guess maybe you meant if, let's say that if at the highest constitutional level they make the boundaries very explicit, no multi-party organization, who's going to enforce that? Well, if it's in the Constitution and it's very transparent, there's greater moral pressure for the government to do that, and if it and to respect those boundaries. And to the extent that it doesn't, it would lose some legitimacy somewhat. So I mean, there'd be more pressure to do it. And the issues are so complex. At the higher levels of government, they require higher levels of analytical ability to process information, and experience at lower levels of government, in a way that only this kind of more meritocratic system allows. So I do think it's a good model, not just a regrettable necessity, but a good model for long-term political rule. Or put it this way, I mean, why did we come up with this idea, in the West, that regardless of the level of government, whether it's a small community of 100 people or a big country of 1.3 billion people, there's like a one-size-fits-all solution for choosing leaders, and namely competitive elections. I mean, it seems, I don't know how we came up with that idea, how it became a kind of sacred dogma that we can't question.
Shouldn't we value people's wanting to live under arrangements that they approve of, or in any case don't oppose if they're going to be forced to live under them? Isn't it infantilizing to not regard it as equally important for everyone to have that desire for self-determination respected, rather than telling people, well, actually in your case it's not as important because you don't know as much as other people?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I don't have. I mean, I don't have experience to run China at the top, and does that mean that I'm an infant? I mean, I just think that, you know, there's plenty of evidence, not just in China, you know, that voters are often irrational, and we need to be cautious, you know, especially at higher levels when the stakes are so huge, about empowering voters. I mean, maybe there's a way of having, you know, informed voters, you know, choose voters at all levels of government. But so far, there's not much evidence to support that view. Now, that said, I mean, I do think that consent is important, and at some point, you know, there might be a need, if only to answer, you know, the critics that coercion lies at the heart of the system, to show that there is widespread consent for the current political system in China. Political surveys show it, you know, including surveys carried out by, you know, Western political scientists, as mentioned, that, you know, at the higher levels of government, there tends to be strong support for the system in China. Now, so then some critics will say, well, why don't you just have elections, and then if people support the system, why can't they just vote for the Communist Party? Because that would change the whole system. I mean, the Communist Party might still be in power, but there would no longer be a meritocratic system with its clear advantages, long-term planning, training of leaders, and so on. So why can't, so there might be a need for that's in the future, maybe, to have some sort of, maybe like a referendum, you know, to ask the people, do you support this kind of China model? You know, maybe it could be called democracy at the bottom, experimentation in the middle, meritocracy at the top, as an ideal that should further inspire political reform, along with a much more open society. You know, that might be a way of securing consent and at least answering the critics who seem to imply that at the end of the day it's coercion that lies at the heart of the system.
Well, you put it in terms of answering the critics, so, you know, that's an important alternative you mentioned, just to get a sense of your position. Suppose that there were evidence, could come from a referendum, could come from consistent polling results, that most people in China would rather have representative democracy with genuine party competition. And let's suppose you still think they're wrong, you think there are long-term goals, you mentioned climate change, for example, that are better served by another system. They disagree, maybe they think it's important, the majority, not to have officials who can just tell them what to do, who they can't vote out of office. Maybe they have a different judgment about what the possibilities of rule of law and radical reduction of corruption are under a one-party regime. You think they're wrong. Would the fact that most people in China want a different system, in your view, be a morally important reason to change in the direction of representative democracy?
Well, okay, I mean, as you know, it's an imaginary scenario, because at the moment there's strong support for the system according to political survey.
Yes.
But let's imagine that if there was a kind of referendum for, let's say, you know, do you support the current system for the next like 30 years? And I'm from Quebec, you know, so we had two referendums in 1980 and 1995, and I think a referendum is different than an ordinary election, because at least not like the one in, you know, Crimea recently, which was done under, you know, the Russian troops with no time for deliberation. But if you have a very extensive period of deliberation and an open political system during that time, and it turns out that the large majority of people, you know, oppose what we can call this China model, then it's a morally strong reason not to favor the current system in China.
Okay, so in that sense, you are a Democrat.
well, if you want to use that word to describe, I think democracy means so many different things, including in China.
Sure.
And that's why in China, democracy is a very popular word. There's very strong support for the word democracy. Everybody favors it, both government officials and social critics. But typically, the meaning in China refers to a government that serves the people, a government for the people rather than government by the people. But including my own students, in my classes on political theory, I teach courses on John Stuart Mill and so on, and ask them, okay, let's take a vote. Now, what do you mean by democracy? Give them a choice, government by the people or for the people, and typically they still support government for the people. So anyway, so what do I? But if by a democrat you mean that I think consent is an important source of legitimacy for the government, then yeah, of course I'm a democrat. But I don't think it's the only source of legitimacy, and this is where maybe I'm less of a pure democrat than some others. I think a government that performs well, a government that takes into account of people's long-term interests, and not just the voting community, but future generations, people living outside the state. I think a government that does those things is also legitimate. It's not just, I don't think consent by the voting community is the only source of legitimacy for government, but I think it is one source of legitimacy, not the only one.
I hope that China can become more a constitutional country, that's where there is a rule of law and basic rights are protected by the state. So basically the liberal part of liberal democracy, that's what I want China to develop. And in terms of economy, I think that now there's too much state control, so there should be more economic freedom, sort of free market economy. So that's what I'm hoping for. But in my own research, I think that one element of liberal democracy, one person, one vote, is problematic. And it's problematic not only for China, but for, I think, every country. So I'm proposing a hybrid regime that combines democratic element, one person, one vote, with meritocratic elements. So I think there should be, elements of political institutions that reflect more the view of the meritocrats, the people who with merits, with political, moral, and intellectual merits.
Are those, someone might say China already has that, that's the Politburo and above all the Standing Committee?
So I think the good part of the Chinese regime, I think, comes from that, the valuing merits. But I think it's done in a very imperfect manner. It's not institutional. There are institutions that promote, select people based upon merits, but there is no clear procedure, and a lot of times it's through connections. And now I think there are a lot of scandals where even you can buy your ranks in militaries. So clearly that's not the kind of meritocracy I'm talking about. So there is the meritocratic element in the Chinese regime, present Chinese regime, but I think it's not far from perfect, far from what I want China and the rest of the world to have. But still, I think it plays a good role to some extent. I guess just one example, every high official, when they become a high official, the first thing they do in China, in East Asia as well, thanks to the Confucian tradition, is to get a PhD degree, right? So to get a PhD degree is a good thing for you to become a high official. But I think in the U.S., almost the opposite. Every politician tries to hide his degree or his or her degree from the public.
At least one blogger has been arrested, presumably to scare others. The firewall seems to be higher on the internet. So, what are your thoughts? You have a liberal part. Does your liberal part worry about that?
Yeah, I do, and I think there are a lot of troublesome phenomena, just like just as you mentioned. But then, why that happens? I think that's something I'm not sure about. I guess a lot of people are just so sure about their judgments. Why that happens because the present administration wants to become more conservative. That I'm not sure. Because the Chinese regime, the top leadership, is a really strange thing. A lot of people consider it authoritarian, but within it, there are a lot of factions. Even the top leader oftentimes cannot just push what he wants to do through the bureaucracy, so in terms of all those disturbing phenomena, we're not sure whether who actually wants that to happen, right, and why that person wants that to happen, right? So you cannot say there is a sort of a solidified leadership that has a sole agenda, right? There are different voices within the leadership, and different people want to do it for different reasons. Some of them probably are just out of their conservative convictions, and some of them do it because they don't want their own dirty laundry to be shown in the public, right? And some people might just do it actually for sort of liberal intentions, right? They want to bring more freedom, but they want that process to be controlled, right? They don't want a lot of people to get in to disrupt that process. In order for that to happen, sometimes you have to have apparently more control before you can loosen up.
Could you explain that now?
I'm not saying that this is what actually happens. I think there is one explanation of that phenomena. So overall, you asked me whether I'm hopeful or pessimistic. I think I'm agnostic.
Okay.
So I don't know. I'm not sure. And what I know for sure is that a lot of people who claim to know for sure, has no ground to be so sure. So that's, I think, my overall stance on this issue. So I'm just saying that it could be the case that say the control of opinions, because they want to do something very controversial, say dismantle the state-owned enterprises, right? And now a lot of bloggers are just puppets for state-owned enterprises, right? And so they don't want that policy to be challenged, so they just want to silence all the dissent in order to dismantle the state-owned enterprises. Then, as a sort of byproduct, as a sort of accidental victim, a lot of bloggers who burn out for that, or for something else, are also silenced. So that could be the case. Or just to use another example, when I was at Peking University, my alma mater, interestingly, oftentimes the conservatives in that university support students to go on street to do street protest. The conservative wanted the students to go on the street so that they could have excuse to purge the liberals, right? See, if we don't get rid of the liberal mandate, we're open-minded, bureaucrats, the student will start a rebellion, right? Here's the evidence, right? Now students are on the street. And so the liberal-minded, people know that. So they don't want students to do that, to threaten their position within the bureaucracy. And if the student can control themselves for now, when more liberal-minded people get higher positions, then they can open up the policies to allow students to express themselves more freely.
if China moves on the path that you think would be best, will there still be a one-party monopoly?
That I don't know. You know, I hope there isn't. Or if there is a one-party anomaly, it's a natural result, not some sort of, you know, you just cannot have different parties, you know, sort of political ban on other parties. So I hope not. But again, you know, I'm not, you know, I'm a philosopher, so I don't do empirical research, so I don't know whether that will be the case. But I hope that, you know, it's not one party by force.
So how someone might say what you hope for China politically is very close to representative constitutional democracy in the West as it is now, except, well, I know you have a thought that it might be good to have a House in the legislature in which people enter on the basis of merit.
Mm-hmm.
But if the other House of the legislature is basically elected through one person, one
Mm-hmm.
vote, if the president is elected through one person, one vote, that's very close.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is that what you hope for China? Some of the things that you said about universal suffrage
Mm-hmm.
wasn't so clear.
Mm-hmm.
So would you know, just again, hopes, nobody knows.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that basically that great change in democracy is what you're looking for with a small variation?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you have worries that that's going too far?
Oh, and I think ideally, you know, that's what I'm hoping for. You know, sort of a much of liberal democracy, minus, you know, plus the more meritocratic elements in the government. What I'm proposing is two possibilities. One, you know, so the House of Commons is open to popular vote, but the House of meritocrats, you know, could be, you know, in order to vote for that house, you know, voters have to take the exam to have some basic knowledge, you know, of you know, political knowledge, like, you know, where you know, some big countries are, you know, relative to each other, and also could be party knowledge, right? There are three parties. What are their basic, you know, convictions, right? Basic proposals, right? You know, objective knowledge, right? You know, basic understanding of what's going on in this kind of political environment. So that could be a test on the voters. If you pass, the test is open to everyone, but only if you pass the test can you vote for the upper house, right? Or it could be a test on the candidates, right? In order to be a candidate for the upper house, you had to take a certain test, right? Probably more rigorous, like, you know, a friend of mine suggested, you know, like the Foreign Service exam in America, right? Which is very difficult. Every diplomat has to take in order to become a diplomat.
How free do you feel to express this view of where China should go?
You know, I'm talking to you now, right?
You're talking to me now, but
yeah.
you know, this is going to be shown to
Yeah.
people in the United States.
Yeah, sure. You know, I just, you know, that's why I chose to become a college professor. I can just say whatever I like to say. I don't want to become a politician. You know, in order to become a politician, you have to be careful about what you're saying. You know, what I'm saying to today now could be leaked. You know, when I try to get into public office, but I don't want to get into public office. So, so in that sense, yeah, I think I'm just really free to say whatever I like to say, even in China.
Okay, I was
Yeah.
thinking of China.
Yeah, sure. So I don't worry that much. I mean, yes, I mean, sometimes, you know, even college professors are censored by the government, but the censorship is just so arbitrary. You never know, you know. You can say a lot of crazy things, but you're fine. One day, you know, a very moderate person will say just one slight, controversial thing, then you're done with. So, in that sense, I stop. I don't care anymore.
What do you mean done with?
Yeah, your contract is, they don't renew your contract. They don't allow you to give courses. I think that's the problem with censorship. It's just so arbitrary, so you could choose to be afraid, and then you cannot say anything, because anything can be censored. Or you can just say whatever you want and see what's going to happen.
So you're making it seem that there's reason to fear, but you just have to decide what you're going to do with your
Right.
life in the face.
Yeah,
of
but
this.
also I think if it were still the Cultural Revolution, I would never choose to speak up, because you know for sure that if you speak up, you're dead, right? Metaphorically or realistically. But now I think now China is a much more open society than it was during the Cultural Revolutions, the Cultural Revolution. So that's why there is so much uncertainty. Because there are so different people, different ideas, and some people try to control, some people try to loosen up the control. So you just never know what's going to happen. And also, I think as a scholar with some kind of ideal, you have your own convictions. You want to push for your ideal. So I think that's a risk I'm willing to take.
Sounds like being an outspoken professor for you is like someone choosing to be a fireman, say.
Right.
There is a built-in risk, and you choose to live that way.
Yeah, very well put. Yeah, yes, yeah. I like that metaphor.
Well, I think as long as popular protests constrain or limit their demands to socioeconomic grievances, the government is increasingly taking an accommodating and tolerant attitude towards these protests that have at the center mostly economic demands. That is, you fight for your unpaid wages, you fight against developers who encroach on your green space as homeowners, you fight for your land rights against corrupt officials who take your land without proper compensation. These are what I call socioeconomic unrest. And I think the government has, over time, taken a more lenient approach. That is, they allow grassroots officials to bargain with these protesters, basically fulfilling most of their demands as much as they can, using their own fund, local fund. But the moment you engage in cross-unit or cross-class mobilization, they will come cracking down, which means that if your protest becomes political, that suggests a threat to the party or to the state, then they would not allow it. But if your demands are limited to monetary issues and the rights that are prescribed by the law, you are in a territory that will be is permissible by the government.
I mean, isn't that very good?
There are lots of people who suffer in different ways who cannot or who do not have the means to overcome what sociologists have called collective action. It's very difficult to pull off a protest, especially in a country like China. And there's no guarantee that the police would not crack down. We are tracing a pattern where, by and large, people are not being arrested for staging a protest. But it's very hard to get to that point where you can band together with 400 people to put up a show of force and to suggest to the local government that there is substantial discontent in the neighborhood or among your group. So it's the possibility for people to go from economic suffering to staging a protest is not affordable. It's not available to everybody. So I don't want to overemphasize the ease with which people can pull off protest. And also it takes a lot of courage and people don't always do it. As in other countries, collective action is very difficult. The bargain, the deal they have always implicitly struck with the general population is that we deliver economic growth, but you don't fuss around with our monopoly of political power. As long as we deliver you the growth and the prosperity that you're seeing increasing income, their bet is Chinese people won't demand for a real share of political power, that the party will remain the only political authority on the land. Having very robust economic growth doesn't mean that people don't want more than robust economic growth. And if you look at what people want, a lot of times they want both. Why can't we as a society enjoy prosperity, which ultimately depend on their own labor? We're talking about working people. It's not like the party said, we have had 7% growth and we'll have 7% growth. For a long time, growth has depended on migrant workers being exploited at a very high rate. That's why Chinese goods are so cheap and everybody else in the world is enjoying it and buying it. And to set as mutually exclusive economic prosperity and more political and civil freedom as mutually incompatible, I don't see this is the way most Chinese people see and or want. As a matter of fact, if you look at the recent development in Hong Kong, I grew up in Hong Kong, so I pay a lot of attention to what is going on there. It is a very good example to see that a wealthy, affluent society is not just satisfied with continuing the capitalist way of life and continue to earn a lot of money, which they continue to do. But as we speak, we see the students boycotting classes, people who are up in arms, have this Occupy Central movement to indicate to China that they don't want to accept this restriction on electing its own chief executive officer. And so you're seeing a society in rebellion against this kind of limited political freedom, even though this is a very wealthy society and has been allowed to continue its way of making money. So we're seeing that, people get rich, but they want freedom as well. Necessity and freedom, these are the two things that we shouldn't put as mutually exclusive, that if you fulfill your necessary needs, economic growth, and enjoy a good life, therefore, then you can place less weight on freedom. And what we're seeing is actually people a lot of times want both. I think it's very easy for us to forget the importance of freedom while we breathe and live in freedom every day in the United States. I think for people who have lived under China, under the Chinese regime, and have come to this country, the first thing that many people have noticed once they have a chance to live here is freedom. You look at a lot of autobiography, a lot of people that you talk to, young and old. Freedom from the eye of the state, freedom from rules that imposed on every aspect of life, freedom on your movement, and the worry that somebody's looking over you behind your shoulder. And that's what you say, what you do will have an impact on your family, on your career. And it is this kind of everyday freedom that we're so used to in the system that we don't see as, we take for granted. And in China, people don't have that kind of luxury. So, but they know that the Chinese way of life is not necessarily the only way of life because of all the information that they get through the internet. And people have gone overseas, they know how people live in other countries. So I think we are seeing as Chinese society that's increasingly unhappy with the fact that they are only allowed to have prosperity and solution to necessities, but not a solution to their demand for freedom. If citizens insist on not marketized, not commodified their right, there is no way this kind of protest bargaining can sustain. And what you see in Hong Kong as we speak, Chinese students in Hong Kong, they are boycotting classes. There is a territory-wide boycott going on because China has given rules to limit direct election of the chief executive. And Hong Kong citizens are saying to Beijing, we want economic growth, but we're not going to bargain away our democratic aspiration. We want universal suffrage. But I'm not seeing in mainland China that Chinese citizen is putting up the same message to the Chinese authority. So another condition for this protest bargaining to continue, to buy stability to continue, is whether citizens are complicit in this game of selling citizens' right. If they don't, then it will spell trouble for this regime of stability maintenance. Another thing that we want to look at when we look at ahead in China's future is not so much social instability, but the fabric of Chinese society in what my colleague in China, Sun Liping, has called social decay. That is, people have no moral limit. There's no bottom line to this society that dares to commodify everything. All the food scares, all the kinds of horrible stories that are coming out of China is because commodification has no boundary, that people do not, the government and citizens do not observe any boundaries there's no limit to what market cannot buy. If somebody can buy this piece of pork, no matter how poisoned, I'm going to produce it because it brings me money. I don't care how people will eat my rice that is contaminated with cadmium. As long as I can sell it, I will grow rice on contaminated water. There's no limit, no moral boundary to this society, and that is a very scary part.